This is Paul Jenkins, and you're listening to the Reluctant Leader Podcast. Now, I believe two things are true. One, everyone leads someone. And two, no one really feels qualified to lead anyone. So maybe you feel overlooked, unqualified, invisible. But the good news is, in the Bible and in life, the most qualified aren't always the most obvious. Well, hey, and welcome to the 12th episode of the Reluctant Leader Podcast. You're going to love this episode, y'all. I interviewed Doug Bursch. I got to know him through Twitter, and we had our first conversation when we did this recording. And it is so rich. If you're not in a place where you can take notes, it's okay. Just listen to it this time through, and then listen to it again when you can really jot some notes down. There's so much wisdom that he drops in this interview about community, right? This thing that we know we're supposed to be a part of, that we all know that we need, but what does it really look like? Man, he really dives deep. I jokingly referred to it as his masterclass on community about halfway through the interview, because I was just so blown away. Every time I'd ask a question, he would just start to talk, and it's just so authentic. It's so honest. You are going to love it. And if you do, would you please share this podcast with somebody else that would benefit from it? Man, we know people that are hungry for community, and we know people who need to hear believers and followers of Jesus talking authentically about community, the good, the bad, and the ugly. And my new friend, Doug, does just that. Let's jump into this interview with Doug Bursch. Hey, listeners, it's so good to have you for another episode. And hey, today we're joined by Doug Bursch. He is, I don't know, you're not in Seattle, are you? But you're close to Seattle, Washington. Is that right?
I am near the Seattle area, between Seattle and Tacoma, and all the fill between those two big cities.
Yeah, it's like out here in where we are. I'm near Charlotte. Anything in North Carolina is near Charlotte, but that's all anybody knows. So you're near Seattle. You're the co-pastor, and I hope we have time to kind of dig into that title of a Foursquare Church. And you're also the host of your own podcast called the Fairly Spiritual Podcast. But you didn't know that I was following you on Twitter, but I was kind of following you at a distance. I'd see some tweets every now and then that kind of caught my attention. But before I even jump into all that, I just wanted to give you the chance just to introduce yourself to our listeners and just kind of let them know, hey, we got this here, my first interview from somebody from the West Coast. It's kind of a big deal, right? I can just hear people clapping right now. But tell us a little bit about who you are and what you do, and just things you enjoy.
Yeah, well, I represent all of the West Coast, or maybe just the Pacific Northwest. Grew up in the Pacific Northwest, and I did a pretty good job of introducing me. I guess the biggest issue are the 30-year anniversary just celebrated with my wife, Jennifer. We got married when we were 20, which was ridiculous, but great for us. And then I've got 4 kids, and one of them's still home with us, which we're so happy, in high school, and 2 in college, and 1's out, just got married. And boy, that was a whole thing, putting that wedding together and officiating and not crying through the entire ceremony, but it's all going good. Wow. And then I co-pastor Evergreen Church in Auburn, Washington. I've been at that same church for, I don't know, this is 24 or 25 years. I've lost track.
Yeah. Wow. So you just married, you officiated the wedding. Like, did you walk her down the aisle, then walk around and do the wedding, or how'd that work out?
Yeah, well, I have a co-pastor, and so he was up front to allow me to give away the bride. And then my older brother's a pastor and my younger brother's a pastor. There were like 7 pastors in the audience. So if I struggled at all, someone could take my place. But I did the rest of the ceremony. But we made it through.
Yeah. How long was that wedding ceremony?
No, I did not allow the other pastors to speak. Yeah. My grandfather was an evangelist, and he said, never give a pastor a mic, you'll never get it back. And I agreed with him on that.
Yeah, I've heard that saying, and I've actually lived in enough services to see that I'm one of those people probably, but it's actually true. It's hard to get a pastor to get the mic back.
This podcast will be 8 hours long. This just you and I talking. We'll say, and one more thing. That's how pastors talk. They go, and one more thing. So,
and we both have our own mics. It's So we'll be talking for a while. I mentioned I was following you on Twitter, and
When I say from a distance, I mean, everybody just kind of, Twitter's a weird place, and you never know who you're going to get connected to. And I don't even honestly know how I got connected with you, but somebody I knew must have liked something, retweeted something. And I just started following you, mainly because you might be one of the wittiest people I know on Twitter. I really appreciate your sense of humor, your take on stuff. And I love the fact that you came out and you actually tweeted, I think, hey, I've got this new book coming out, and you can talk about that later, but because my new book's coming out, y'all should probably go read my other book. And so I found the other book, and it's called The Community of God. I started reading it, and you had me as I'm reading it, not because you wrote about community, but because you authentically wrote about community. I mean, when you have chapter titles called The Dark Side of Community, it's like, finally somebody is saying this kind of stuff. So I know that when I ask you, hey, take a minute and talk about community and why it's so important, that's a huge question, but I'm just going to give you the freedom to take it any direction you want when it comes to that theme of community for believers.
Well, maybe I'll first go at the title. It's nice actually to talk about my first book, because I've been spending a lot of time talking about the one I have on social media. But the subtitle of that book kind of gives the heart of it. It's The Community of God, a theology of the church from a reluctant pastor. And what I wanted people to know is, often people who say, we need to be in Christian community, you think, well, that guy just likes being with people. It's easy for him to say or her to say, but for me, I just don't like being with people. And I wanted people to know, and if you've read the book, you've seen this, that I don't naturally want to be in community. I've learned that it is good to be in healthy Christian community, but my inclination in the past, in the present, and probably in the future is I want to isolate and hide away. And so I write it from that perspective. As someone, I'm almost trying to convince myself of why this is important and going to scripture for that. So that was the first part. And the other part is, so often with the church, we talk about everything in individualistic terms. And I'm sure this happened for you as you were reading through it, because I just kind of touched the surface. Each of those chapters, you could just go deeper into the implications of it. But so many of the ways we present salvation, it's individualistic. Sanctification, individualistic. Church attendance, and I give an example where even if we say you need to go to the community group, like you need to come to the home group or the small group or the Bible study, we say they need to do that because it'll help them in their individual faith. We still give an individualistic motivation for people to be in community. And so I just try to unpack that, where the Bible always talks about us. It's never just me. I'm a part of it, but it's always us. And so that was kind of the motivator behind that. And I think every one of us, because we're around ourselves a lot, could use a little bit more talking about us and the bigger picture of why we gather in community than just what meets my needs and serves my purposes.
Yeah, it's so true. I mean, I see it in me more. I tell the church all the time, like, I mean, I'm not really in your stuff because I'm trying to get my stuff worked out. We are so individualistic. Everything is, how can your individual faith get stronger? And when I read your book, it convicted me. I thought about all the times I've gotten on the platform and said, hey, you need to join a ministry team and serve, because then your faith will get stronger, or you need to be in community group because that's what you need to do for your faith. But it's the roots going down deep, and not just deep, but entwined with one another.
Yeah.
That kind of community is hard. It's like iron sharpening iron, life on life. It's a deal.
Yeah, and when people think of community, often we think of the people who've hurt us. But we know individually we sin, yet still we can have a relationship with God. Well, it's true of communities as well. And I've seen people, well, because the church hurt me, because other people hurt me, I'm not involved in that anymore. Well, that's like anything. Just because I've sinned personally against God, it doesn't mean I don't try to have as healthy of a relationship I can have as an individual and in a community perspective. And one of the places I'll start, and I'll guest speak at places, and I'll ask them this question. Paul talks about Abraham being the example of how we're saved by faith and not by works. And so I'll ask people, what did Abraham believe in? And people will say some general thing. Well, God. He believed in God, and it was credited to him as righteousness. But there's a deeper story there, that Abraham believed the promises of God. So then I'll ask the people, well, what are the promises of God? And again, many Christians don't know what God's promises actually were to Abraham. Well, you look maybe 3 different places, probably more, where God comes to Abraham and makes him this promise: I am going to make you into a people that will bless the rest of the people on the face of the earth. And Abraham believed that, and it was credited to him as righteousness. So the very promise that God gives to Abraham is a promise of community. So when Christ came to the cross, not just to die for our personal sins so that we could go to heaven, but also so that that promise to Abraham could be fulfilled, that we would truly become a people that would bless the rest of the people on the face of the earth. Well, if you see that as the primary goal of God from the beginning, Old Testament to the New Testament, then you can't live your faith in isolation. There's an aspect of God calling us into community for the purpose of blessing the rest of the people on the face of the earth. That little thing right there that I've taught, 80%, maybe 90% of the churches I go to, Christians have no idea that part of the reasons Christ went to the cross is so that we could become a people that would bless other people on the face of the earth.
Man. Yeah, I would imagine. I'm just picturing people's faces going, wait, that's in the Bible? It's like, that's actually part of it. One of the things that we talk about a lot in our church is we all want a New Testament expression of our faith. You know, as a pastor, I just love that. People are like, I wish we could get back to that Acts church. And right. I also, you know, I hear like, I read Acts, I'm like, I want to see that. But I'm just convinced part of the reason why the church was so strong then is because they couldn't get on their donkey and ride past 3 or 4 or 5 churches to get to a church. Like they were forced to be with the people that they were with, and they couldn't run away because the person I actually live with just made me mad, or the person that lives next to me made me mad. They had to work that out in community.
Yeah. Well, it's interesting. When we baptize, a lot of people go, well, why do you baptize? Well, Jesus told us to get baptized, but we kind of do it as a ritual, but we don't know why. Well, in the New Testament era, when someone got baptized, that meant it's over for their former life. It's much more like a Muslim world, right? If you confess Christ in some Muslim communities, you could be martyred, you could be killed, you'd be disowned from your family. Now in America, if you get baptized, your non-Christian family goes, okay, fine, he's doing something. Some might get upset at you. But in the New Testament context, they were disowned by their family. And that's why in the Acts church, they sold their possessions and gave to one another, is because if you were not the eldest male, you lost all property. And so you were you had no income, you had no family, you were destitute. So the eldest males who owned the property were beginning to sell their property, and those who didn't have were able to receive, that money. So that concept of baptism is, once you've committed to Christ, you're committed to that community. So baptism is entrusting yourself into a community, because you're clearly going to offend the community you've come out of. We don't have that concept in our baptism. It's more of just kind of a outward expression of a personal conviction, a restarting of my life. The water washes me clean. But it would almost be like this if today I said, I've joined Al-Qaeda, something like that. And then a week later I said, nah, I'm no longer from Al-Qaeda. People go, you can't do that. You can't be on one side and then another. And so part of this issue of being in community is that was your family. Once you gave your life to Christ and were baptized publicly, you don't go home to your dad or your granddad or your family. And so you have to learn how to be a family. We don't do it. It's more kind of opinions and dogmas and doctrines and ideas about God that we accept on the buffet of life. And we can do it a little bit or a lot, but the consequences really aren't there. As you mentioned earlier, we can't just go down the road to something else or just say, we changed our mind. Once they made those commitments during Christ's time, it was a full-on commitment. And so at some level, I have to intentionally embrace that kind of reality. There's no going back. I've been called to be a part of a people that will bless the rest of the people on the face of the earth.
Yeah, if you're just joining us, this is Pastor Doug Bursch, and this is his masterclass on community. So many good nuggets just in what you're sharing right there. How are you seeing that played out? You pastor a local church. I mean, how do you see this play out in real time, in real life, with real people?
Well, and I'm not trying to sell 2 books to anybody, but this theme is in both the books I've written, and the social media age has created in us even more this concept of networked individualism. And there was 2 scholars, Rainey and Wellman, who talked about this as a good thing, where online you can say, I have a need. Let's say, I want to hang out with people who like Star Trek. So my individualistic need to like Star Trek, I can just go find all these other Trekkies all over the world, and we can hang out in these chat groups, and I can meet my individual needs. The internet has become that, where anything in our life, we have a need, we can Google it, and we can find people who meet that need. I want to meet people who have the same religious convictions, the same political convictions as me. But the problem with this network individualism is we're beginning to use people for as much as they meet our individualistic needs. And we're not willing to go through the conflicts that occur when you abide in community. So in the church, when you come to a disagreement, when you don't have the same opinion about your politics, when you have different opinions about even things that seem somewhat essential for the church, instead of saying, this is my community, and I got to find a way to walk through that and go through this conflict, what do? We just replace them with someone else. The strength of the internet age is we have more opportunities for relationships and information than ever before. Guess what the weakness of the internet age is? We have more opportunity to relationships and information than ever before. And I talk about this in depth, in quite a bit in my book, Posting Peace, is why did people reconcile in the olden times? Before the internet, before even cars. They did it because they had to, because they didn't have any other one to hang out with. If you didn't get along with your neighbors, there's no one to talk to. There's only 2 churches in town. If you don't get along in that church and find a way to exist, you don't go to church, and you don't go online to find sermons. Now, that's not all good. So what did they have to do? They had to find ways to reconcile and deal with difficult people. I'm glad that we have options. I'm glad I don't have one controlling pastor in the town that makes everybody do what he wants them to do. I'm glad we're not doing that. But this gift of community and all these different options we have and all these different churches and all these different books, that gift is keeping us from doing the difficult work of going through conflicts. And in every important relationship, it has to go through a conflict. Any deep relationship, any relationship that's not just one-dimensional, you have to find a way to abide together in disagreement. That's true with marriage, it's true with our kids, it's true with friendships. So this is what I think is happening in the church, is the moment you do something wrong, they're not even upset with you. They're just like, I can go somewhere else. I can get it somewhere else. So it's just becoming less central to really invest in the people that God has entrusted to your care.
Yeah, and I wonder how that's playing into, like, now that, I don't know when COVID's ever going to be over, but, now that it seems like we're trying to kind of reintegrate into some semblance of a normal life.
Yeah.
How hard is it for people to come back together when, I'm hearing you talk and thinking, man, like, if somebody can just throw me away and go find another group, I don't feel any value in that. And at the same time, I've probably done that to people as well. So you got a whole bunch of people that don't feel valued by community.
Yeah.
And now they're not going to value community. And how do we keep from just spreading the brokenness all around and just never finding that authentic expression?
Well, this is the real challenge. And I try to write from an optimistic perspective that regardless of what's happening around the world, God has called us to make a difference, and that we have a step we can take to let thy kingdom come, thy will be done. So it's not to make people feel guilty about not going to a certain church or guilty about their decisions. But we have to have this value, and that's why I call it a theology of the church. And it's not a theology of you have to go to a mega church or a small church or a home church, whatever that is. We must have a theology that is essential that we gather together with other people on a regular basis through conflicts, and that group must be large enough for some people to annoy us and small enough to actually connect with someone. It's not just you left the large church, now you're hanging out in your house with your friends that you made at the large church. I don't think that is a church. That's basically taking something that was created somewhere else and now using it to serve yourself. Ultimately, and I don't really care how that looks. I don't think the Bible says a lot about how that looks, but at some level, whether you all meet on a hill somewhere in the country or you meet in a big cathedral, some place where we gather on a consistent basis to go through conflicts and to demonstrate love. And why is this important? Because the Bible says it's not good for humans to be alone. When Adam was formed, I think this is more than just, when Eve's formed, it's more than just marriage. It's more than just gender. Adam went into the dust, and the Bible says that, whether you say a rib or it took a part of Adam, that when Adam woke up, he looked at Eve and he didn't just say, where's my rib? He said, you are bone of my bones and flesh of my flesh. Together we're one. And I don't think that was a pickup line. That wasn't a Jerry Maguire, you complete me kind of thing. Mm-hmm. It was that Adam suddenly realized, I don't have enough in and of myself to be whole. I need community. And that's why I think it's more than marriage, because people can have wholeness and not be married.
Right.
But to be human is to be in community, because God said it's not good for man to be alone, for humans to exist alone. We must learn what it means to be human through being dependent upon others. And if you think about it, that's the only way we can really understand the mystery of the Trinity. Now, God is one. I'm not creating some heresy here. I'm a Trinitarian, I believe Protestant Trinitarian. But we know God is one God, but three persons. God is community. There is love between the Father and the Son and the Spirit. And there's mystery in that. For us even to understand the love of God, community had to be created. To understand who God is and to understand who we are, we at some level must abide in community. And this is the challenge. Now that has to be a value, because if you just go by your own desires, you're not going to do it. It's easier. I would rather be with my family, honestly. I'd rather be with my wife and my kids. But Paul talks about that's the sin of humanity, that instead of serving the Creator, he says this in the beginning of Romans, we serve the created. So God created a great marriage. So instead of serving the Creator who gave me that marriage, I just serve my marriage and hang out with my wife all the time. Well, why do we go into church? Because I'm not serving the created. It's not just to serve me. I'm not going to church to make my life better. I'm gathering in Christian community because Christ is in me and Christ is reconciling the world to him. And I'm called to understand who I am and who God is by reaching out to the world that God has created. So it's not just for me. If you think it's just for you, you're only going to go for short seasons, or you're going to go to church for 4 years and another church for 4 years, another church for 4 years, because eventually people annoy you, disappoint you, frustrate you. But if it's about something larger, then you'll abide through conflicts and in spite of conflicts.
Wow. I don't go to church to make myself better. That's so good. I mean, it is, but even when you said that, I was like, man, it just almost slaps you in the face, because that's all we've ever heard is pick a church that can help you get better, that can help you get stronger, as opposed to, when I was in seminary, boy, people that know me, they're like, you went to seminary? When I was there, they specifically told us, you got to go find a church to be a part of. And we will not allow all the students to huddle up and go to the same church.
Yeah.
And so I walk into this church and it's like, I don't know, a building that holds 450. There might be 50 people in there.
Yeah.
And introduced myself as somebody who was studying to get my master's of divinity. So I wanted to be a youth pastor. And the second week I was there, my name was at the top of the bulletin as Paul Jenkins, youth pastor. And I was like, wait, how did that happen? I'm literally just a student. It was a church that could meet no needs, right?
Yeah.
Like they were just on life support. But what an opportunity to jump in and just be, and I don't say it to make myself a hero. I would have rather been somewhere that was a lot easier. But you just lock arms and it's like, well, let's work together. Let's figure this out.
Well, this is a huge problem to me with, if you want to look at large churches versus small churches, and I have friends of large churches and small, so this isn't me picking one side or another. But large churches, you can avoid difficult people. So if there's 3 or 4 Bible studies, you can find the one you want to be with. Even if you're in the fellowship hall, you can just avoid the difficult people. So we have a bunch of large churches, but then the majority of churches are very small. And small churches, you have one women's group, you have one men's group, and you can't avoid the trouble. And if you're just going in order to have a great time, you won't go to a small church. Because if you go to that one Bible study that has 5 women and one of the women is going through a divorce, and in that place she's feeling lots of hurt and lots of crying and if you're there for her needs, you're going to probably leave that study going, whoa, that was kind of tough. That really wasn't about me. Or maybe someone has mental illness and you're trying to help them get help for their mental illness. That's not, hey, I'm just going to go so I can feel better and get close to God. And so I think this is what's happening. Our larger churches are becoming people often who don't have family, don't have relationships, all their bridges are burned, they need community. Those can be people that are pretty needy. And so then you're pastoring the small church with a lot of needs and no one really to help you. And then the larger church is kind of that disengaged, I can show up when I want to and kind of get something in my life. Now that's an exaggeration and an extreme. But I think if we were to honestly look at that, Why are we going to what we're going to? Is it so it meets my needs? Or is it because God has called me to invest in these people? People would say with our church, we've always had a very small church, which I just call a normal sized church. But people would say, oh, Pastor, I love your preaching, but we need to go somewhere else because we just need more for our children. I don't know if you've ever gotten that. We just need more for our kids. And I wanted to say to them, oh, I'm glad you can escape. I guess my kids are just going to hell because they have to go here.
Way too honest.
That mindset is really silly. It really is. And by the way, some of the most angry, bitter, hate the church people were raised in these amazing churches with all these programs and structures. So you're not going to deal with someone's soul just through lots of programs. That's not where it's going to happen. But that idea is I had to believe I'm called here. And my children will thrive here, even if it's just a small group of people. If we make room for the Lord, if we love people with integrity, if we welcome the fullness of Christ, we can prosper and others will prosper as we intentionally invest in this community. But that has to be a motivation beyond yourself. If it's just about yourself, it's too hard. You'll go to a place that you can hide out or just get your needs met.
Yeah. Yeah. I'm a little hesitant. I'm a little reluctant to be the guy that quotes somebody else's book to them, right? But I found I found a lot of quotes, but I went through this one section of your book, The Community of God, and I just found myself like, have you ever highlighted so much that you might as well just have a yellow page? Yeah. Two statements that really stood out to me. Very honest. One was, you've said, in those first few years of ministry, I came to the stark realization that no one can avoid the conflict and hurt of community. Mm-hmm. And then the very next page, over time, I have learned to appreciate the assignment of simply loving people. Mm-hmm. And I just thought, man, those two statements, they kind of scream backstory, right? But in ministry, I just think it's refreshing that you're at least honest enough to say, and we try to say the same thing to people, like, we're not calling you some idealized community, like Pollyanna, get together, everybody's going to get along. No, we're calling you, we just had a meeting this morning about community groups in the fall and kind of joking about, should we just change the name to conflict groups? Because that's kind of what they are.
Yeah.
We're trying to demystify that. Like, if there's one person in the room, you're going to have conflict. We can't even get along with our own thoughts, right? Yeah. So it shouldn't surprise us that if there's 6 or 7 or 8 or 10 or 12 people in the room, it's going to be some conflict. I just appreciate that you see that, you would say it, and then just bring it back to, like, at the end of the day, we're just trying to love people.
Yeah.
Right? We just want to love people well.
Well, I'm glad you brought that up. Like, it's easier for me to preach and teach something and even do this podcast than to live it. And one of my biggest goals in life is just not to be hurt. I don't want people to hurt me. And I know I'm supposed to be tougher than that, but I don't want to be hurt. And you get hurt by people. So I'm always wanting to run away and to quit. When I first started pastoring, though, I thought, well, if I'm just kind of nice to people, and I'm not a big jerk, they might not continue to go to the church, but, they won't be mean to me. They won't, which is such a silly thing, because were people mean to Jesus because he was bad? Like, people have been mean to everybody. Jesus, Paul, Peter, not to say I'm in that category, but I wasn't going to be nicer than Jesus. And it didn't mean that I wasn't going to face conflict. But that really hit me, where I realized that a lot of the reasons I will love people is often not the best reason. It looks like love, but I'm really trying to control them. And let me explain. Like, I don't want conflict, so I try to meet their needs so I won't have conflict. I try to do the right thing and serve them so I won't have conflict. So it's anxiety produced, right? I'm just out of anxiety. I was ministering to people, helping people, trying to solve problems. But the problem is, another problem will just come up, and another problem will just come up. And then you start not wanting to be around people because they're just problems to be fixed instead of people to be loved. And for me, I've had to realize that the goal is not to have less conflict. The goal is not to solve all the problems. The goal is to learn how to love in every situation. Every conflict is an opportunity to love. Every relationship is an opportunity to love. But then I also have to be honest. For me, I have to have boundaries with the community. I don't hang out with people a lot. The church understands that with me, that I'm not going to pretend to be someone I'm not. I'm not going to just kill myself doing what other people think I'm supposed to do, and then I just wear out. Mm-hmm. So that makes me a bad pastor to some people, because I won't meet with them at a moment's notice, and I'm not on the phone all the time with them. But for me to do this long term, I had to be who I am and trust, the harvest is ripe, the workers are few, I'm doing my best, people can replace me and do better. But for me to do this long term, I have to have these boundaries where I can get away from people and I can be alone. And I'm not in an endless home group as people are sharing endless prayer requests and I'm going crazy. I have to find ways to grow too as someone who is a little bit of an introvert. I love talking about God, but being in communities that feel unsafe or out of my control, that's where I'm an introvert. It just drains me, and I'd rather do anything but be in that small group as we just talk about things and talk about God.
Yeah. We talk about introverts and extroverts a lot, in our church, because we are kind of a church of introverts, our personal church, not necessarily the Big C church, but our local expression. And these commands apply to introverts as well as extroverts. It wasn't like when God said, hey, it's not good for man to be alone. He meant all the extroverts get together, have a big party. Like, it's all of us. We all have to figure that out. And trying to honor each other the way that we're wired, right?
Yeah.
So some communities look very different than other communities because of the personalities that are in there. But if an extrovert and an introvert can't get in the same room and figure that out, then it's like Democrat, Republican, right? I mean, we got to figure out how to love people that are different than.
Well, and sorry, I'm interrupting you. We need both, like a family. You don't need everybody talking. You need everyone in the room and to value what their needs are as best you can. That's what you do in community. You learn. Like, sometimes we think the world is what we hear online, the most loud people, but that's not the world. You ever go to Thanksgiving and there's the uncle that talks a lot and annoys everyone? And maybe there's someone who argues with him. How many other people do you not hear, but they're essential to that Thanksgiving gathering, where they're peacemakers, they're setting the table, they're moving discussions in a certain direction, they're pulling people aside and having conversations, right? Are those people needed there? You bet. Do they want to be there during the conflict? Probably not. They'd probably rather be somewhere else. They're all needed. And so to me, like introvert, the definition I'd heard for an introvert, rooms drain you, community drains you. Extroverts, you just get fed by it. You just want more. You won't leave. You close the lights off and the extrovert's still there saying they want more. They just can't take a hint that it's time to go home. So to me, communities need to value that reality, giving people permission to leave, right? Permission to not participate. Permission to be there not as much as other people. Like I've made that commitment that I'm not going to judge people, that if you're a real Christian, you got to be at church every week. I don't know that. I do not know someone's condition. I can talk about the benefits of it, but I need to welcome that person that I see once a month. They sit way in the back. I barely know what's going on in their life, but I feel like at some level they're trying to be a part of community because their spirituality isn't worse than the person who's talking all the time and saying amen and very public. I've often found that those people are even more messed up. They have a public persona, but the reality is their life is just as broken or more broken than the person that we barely can understand or see in the back of the church.
Yeah. Wow. I was going to say, like, is there anything you want to share with young leaders? But I think this entire podcast, I mean, you speak from a place of experience. You've been through some stuff, and there's balance there in a good way. There's passion for authentic expressions of what the Bible says, and I'm sure it's encouraging. If you were starting out in today's climate, I mean, there's a question. What would you say? But you know,
well, this might discourage people, but I think we're going to see a tremendous decline in church attendance in the next, 10, 20 years. And I just think we are. The idea of going culturally to church has passed. I'm not saying that's a good thing, but you're not just going to show up because that's the thing everybody else does. So if you're a young pastor going into ministry, I've told pastors this throughout life, but even more so, I would make ministry personal. Personal in this is structure ministry and the church around the core of who you are, unapologetically. People say, well, it's not about you, it's about Jesus. Well, I get that. But if you want to do this long term, we need you and we need your unique giftings. So if you're someone who just doesn't like preaching at all and you just like hanging out with people, then structure your church around that. do that. You're going to have some sort of preaching and teaching. You may have to find other people to do that. It may be shallower than what people want. But you know who's going to gravitate towards the church you serve? Is people who've heard enough sermons, but they need someone to hang out with them. So you're needed. Now, I'm not that kind of person. To me, I'm very much a verbal communicator, writer, lots of time on that. So I've structured the church around that. Guess what happens? People do the other stuff. The people who are more the social kind of interaction, they love me. They let me do what I'm going to do. And then they do the stuff they do well. So I would encourage pastors to make it very personal. You're going to be rejected no matter what you do. Why not be rejected doing what you love? And because you're going to be bitter if you're doing not what you want to do, but because some elders told you to do it, or council members, or some book someone gave you told you to do this, you don't like doing it, you're not good at it, and then they reject you. That is like one of the worst feelings, because you didn't even like what you're doing, and they still don't like you. It'd be better to be like, this is what I love, this is what I'm about, these are the spiritual gifts, and then when someone rejects you, they reject the core of what you love, and then you can just be, I'm sorry, this is who I am. If you don't love this about our church, then you probably should go somewhere else, because this is the reason I'm pastoring right now. Whether it's to help with the poor, whether it's justice, whether it's evangelism, there's got to be uniqueness in that, because there's a lot of people to reach, and the church should at some level in leadership be as diverse and unique as the people we're trying to reach. So that's what I'd tell young leaders. Just try to, and then also manage expectations. Are you going to be okay if you never grow, if you never have enough money to survive, if all the dreams you think are going to happen don't happen? Everything we do has to have value in the doing, not for a future payoff. So if you can say this has value in doing, then do it. Just do it for the most. So if gathering together had value in the doing and you never did it again, then praise God. Where ministers get in trouble is when they're working for a future payoff. Like, we're just going to sacrifice my family and my life because we're going to grow a church and someday this will all change. That's a terrible way to live your life for some future return that may or may not come. One, when the return does come, it won't satisfy you, and you'll realize you've wasted your life. The other thing is it usually doesn't come. The church doesn't express itself the way you thought it would, and then you're bitter because you wasted all this time for a future that never happened. Find ministry that has value in the doing, where this was good, God was here, people were ministered to. I hope it grows. I hope we can do it more. I hope we're moving in another direction. But even if we have to shut it all down, I'm not going to regret a single day of ministry. If you can structure ministry that way, then I think you'll have a vital ministry and a healthy relationship with the people God has entrusted to your care.
Wow. So much wisdom in that answer. Gosh, thank you so much. I know that you didn't do this to sell books, because you've probably looked at my stats and realized there's not a huge listener base yet, right? And I so appreciate, like, just at the invite, you were like, yeah, let's do this.
You bet.
Man, I have grown so much. Just listen, you talk about community. It resonates so much with myself, and I know it does with our listeners. My guess is that people are going to want to buy your stuff. And if you'll just kind of point us in a direction of how they can find your books and follow you, I'd love to link your podcast. Just all the things you're doing, we'll link it in the show notes.
Well, one, it's a privilege to talk with you. And what you're doing has tremendous value. And that alone makes this worthwhile. It really does. But everyone should recognize this. If you can encourage one person, you can encourage thousands of people. Life is just relationships. So it's a privilege for you to ask me to do this. Another issue is I'm very unsuccessful, and it doesn't matter whatever podcast I'm on. I don't seem to be able to sell anything. So don't worry about that. People can go to fairlyspiritual.org, dougbursch.org, postingpeace.org. It'll all get you there. And then I want to offer this. If you're a pastor listening, or if you're running a small group or a Bible study where you need at least 10 books, now I can't do them of the community of God, but I can do them of Posting Peace. I'd like to just get those books to you to find a way. So if you can email me through my website, at least to a couple people, I got probably like 25, 50 books I'd like to give away. So but that means you're going to run a group, because I want to help a church. So if it's a youth group, that's my Posting Peace book. I just have more copies of that available right now. I'd be glad to mail that to you. So that's my heart, is to support people. If you have questions, email me, and I'd be glad to answer them as well.
Man, that's such a generous offer. Now, listen, I had one more question, but I'm not going to ask it because then maybe I can get you to come back on.
Oh, yeah.
Because I would love to dig into that co-pastoring term, right?
Yeah.
Because again, what I love, just our first time meeting, you're just the authenticity of who you are. You're not just saying community, like you're doing it. There's value, like you just said, there's value in doing community.
Yeah, one, I would love to come on for anything. I enjoyed this conversation, but that particularly is an area where we have hundreds and thousands of leadership books and Christian leadership books that don't talk about co-pastoring and pastoring in twos. And yet that is one of the clearest examples in the Bible of how we're called to minister. Jesus sets that example. So I would love to talk about why it's something I'm passionate about and would advocate that we actually learn to minister with other people.
So you were on the podcast and then you just did the teaser for the next time we have you on the podcast. You're like a multi-talented guy. You're making my job super easy, right? I read about that and it really piqued my interest because even when I was planting our church, I had said to a leader, I really just kind of want to be like on a team. And the response was, yeah, you can't do that. It'll be like a two-headed monster. And maybe, I don't know, but again, we'll have to jump into that another time because I think when the things I read in your book, there is such value in what you're doing. I cannot imagine it's been easy. And I hope that this whets the appetite for people to join next time they see your name on the podcast, right?
Yeah,
because there's a lot there. Thank you again for spending time with us. And I hope you enjoy the rest of, you have more day to enjoy because you're 3 hours behind me. So I hope you enjoy the rest of your day. Thank you again for being a part of the podcast.
Thanks for having me.
You've been listening to the Reluctant Leader Podcast. Thanks so much for being a part of this conversation. You can follow us at the reluctantleaderpodcast.com or wherever you download your podcast. Be sure that you subscribe and like us and leave us a rating and a comment. We'd love to hear from you and hear what God's showing you. And remember this, no matter how reluctant you feel, keep saying yes and He'll do the rest.